As the historian in Rexafel approached the Amaranth, he could not help but to think about the book and how the chronicles written on it make this art castle city an impossibility. They reached the courtyard of the castle. They noticed that the entire place is filled with dead, rotten fish, barnacles stuck in the walls, and a place that has been abandoned for a long time, but also a place that seemed to have lived underwater. The strangest part of the entire scenery is not that the place exists, or that the entire place is filled with unnatural, rotten, and slimy look and feel, but is that there is no sign that anyone is still alive, or that anyone ever lived here. No human remains anywhere. How is that possible? The heavy wooden gate was rotten through, fallen from the rusted hinges, as if it's from the passage of centuries, not decades. Candle holders on the walls drip with dark green slime. Rust peels away from the iron barred windows like layers of dead skin. This place is far older than what history of Shaish says. This is where the historian thinks about those passages found in the book written about the unknown person that witnessed what happened in the Amaranth all those years ago. The Amaranth is rotten. Rot has spread from the fish in the fouled water, and it has spread in the shriveled hearts. It has crept into the very stone of this ancient place, until the dreams of sanctuary now feel swollen, black, and bloated around us. Fetid water soaks into everything, into the houses they have built, into the well and the provisions, and into their clothes and skin, and they drink in it, bathe in it, and defecate in it, and eat the fruit of the poisonous sea. I fear they have forgotten what it means to be men and women. Life is hope and love, and they are without those things. The writer of the book says that they have been sailing for 7 years, and the people have now lost most of their humanity. But despite everything they are going through, they still gather around those towers of hope, and they hope that with their towing of the bells, Sigmar will hail them and make their existence better. But they look up to the distant stars as they call out to a god that will not, cannot answer, because he is not coming and they are all alone. It was until the 20th year of their voyage that now the people began to lose their sense of hope and salvation, and the star of Azir has not been seen since. The people of the city have now begun to toll the bells in an unholy way. They go to a place beneath the castle, and from there screams can be heard. Those are the screams of people that have begun to worship the dark gods. And the suspicion is confirmed when they begin to attack the Lord of the Sea and his family. In a moment that must have felt an eternity, the Lord of the Sea witnesses his daughter get killed and his beloved get torn apart by the decaying hands of the once people of the Amaranth. Now nothing remained of them. They had fallen to the whim of the plague god, but in their twisted worldview, they admit that they have been worshipping Nurgle, but in their view, they have not been worshipping to ask for his favor, but instead, it was to keep him away. The people began to make signals in the dirt, and it turns out to be a spell to call upon a great unclean one. As the Lord of the Sea witnessed such a thing happen before his eyes, he thinks to himself some very profound words as he writes, "In the absence of hope, fear disappears. Now the worst is not a possibility, it is certainty. There is nothing to fear anymore. There is nothing worse out there than already exists in your head. I give up on hope. I discard it. And I find that in the absence of hope is not the same as despair. I see now that hope is the cause of despair. It is the root of all suffering. I give up on the false promise of hope, and I take strength from this absence. I take strength from this void in the core of my being. We are told to defy the dark, told to hold a light against it. But if you extinguish that light and wait in the dark for the horrors, then you can master the darkness, or can confront the monsters in your head and you can reach out and break its neck. As the Lord of the Sea thinks this, he watches as his once people have now become creatures of Nurgle, pale, rotten, and he pities them, and he summons his last strength and does one last spell. For the portal that the people used to summon the great unclean one works both ways, and with his last strength, he drowns them all, including himself. He summons the sea to take the castle deep down into the abyss. And this is why the historian thinks this city to be impossible, because the Amaranth should be underwater, if it did exist at all. As the initial shock of seeing the Amaranth begins to subtly fade, the brave questors begin to descend into the abyss. In the castle, they go further down into what they think is the natural made caverns from years of being submerged. But now that the Amaranth was somehow again floating on the water, the caves were soaked in thick slime and the stench of rot and decay, a place that does not seem to be just a couple of 100 years old. They finally realized that in fact this was not a cave, but an actual man-made chamber that over the years was made to look that way. They can spot what seems to be the resemblance of stairs and an old corroded iron. They stumble upon what is left of a door, corroded beyond recognition, and they enter into a vast glass-domed seating chamber. The room is full of ancient astronomy equipment, now rendered useless over the wheel of time. This is how the Lord of the Sea kept record of the time of their imprisoned voyage, waiting to be rescued and to be brought back to the land of Shaiish, waiting to be brought back to a sense of life. As they looked into the room, they noticed that the astronomical clock had stopped functioning when nobody was there to take care of it any longer, and they began to see when was the last time someone moved the needle to indicate their years of voyage. And that is where the impossible came true. In fact, the Amaranth was not lost just a couple of hundred of years ago. Maybe it's the land of Shaiish that messes with time, or something in the edge of the realm. But according to the needle, the Amaranth has been in voyage for 2,000 years. Now, we don't know when exactly the Age of Chaos began, but at least here we have a date. Could the Amaranth point us to how life was like when the Age of Chaos began? But also, how is it possible for this ark to be thought to be just hundreds of years old is in fact thousands? Makes you question how many stories we hear of the mortal realms are far older than we think. At some point, memories become so unreal, they begin to feel like dreams, and memories can be changed over the course of time, and this is one of those stories. As they react in their shock of the age of this ark, and for how long Sigmar abandoned these people, they begin to feel the ground shake. Something is happening with the Amaranth, the ark. It's rising. The great hall behind the copper door is draining. The sea comes frothing and surging as it pours away through the underground crack and fissures. The receding water reveals the true size of the hall, a cast of ragged vein formed from the fusion of the castle foundation and the basalt sea caves beneath. The walls of the void, encrusted with orchids, barnacles, seaweed, and slime, make it seem as if you are watching the sea floor. The historian catches sight of something else revealed in the hall. White, fleshy sacs the size of a man are uncovered. Bulbous growths with translucent tentacles like those of a jellyfish. They stream with water, and he watches in horror as they begin to split like cocoons, peeling open and spilling out pink water that then becomes a thicker white liquid. Then from one of the sacs a figure emerges, a slender human arm thrust out from the membrane, fish belly white, slothy skin as it putrefies to the point of liquescence. And then more beings began to rupture the sacs, and soon all the sacs were open and hundreds come out, and with purpose. They stumble and crawl, tearing themselves on jagged stones and spilling out horrible liquids from their bodies. Yet, with all their weak appearances, they moved, but not to the historian. It seems they hear the calls of the bells. They heed the call to prayer. As the sight of these hideous creatures gets closer to the historian, he decides to retreat and look for the rest of the crew of the Selenita and his quest companion Rexaphael, who were separated when the island began to rise from the sea even further. He heads to the ship, but the ship is now sailing away. The damned sailors left him, and Rexaphael stranded in the island with these creatures. Therefore, his only way to survival was to seek Rexaphael, for he will have the strength to protect them. He turns and scrambles quickly back along the bridge into the courtyard. He slips in the mud and stumbles through the gate, falling to his hands and knees, looking up through the tangled wet hair plastered on his face. And in the center of the courtyard, surrounded by horror and madness, he witnesses an avatar of thunder and lightning. Electricity flickers around the storm-cast unhelmeted head. Sparks trail from his eyes as if they were tears. He is being attacked by all sides, by dozens of creatures, and more still to come. And with their deformed hands they reach forth. They are reaching for what seems to be the stars. Could they be reaching for a Zir still? By each bolt of arrows he fires, Rexaphael lands a target, but there are too many, and they are surrounding him. And he runs out of ammunition, despite piles of bodies laying in the ground and featureless faces with no eyes or mouths still approach him. As they get closer, he switches weapons to his electrifying hammer, but even that in the end turns out not enough. The slimy creatures have now piled on top of the avatar of Sigmar himself. It reaches to the point that their dead slimy bodies have gone in between the joints of his armor, that he can no longer move. And witnessing this, and now with the sudden and abrupt stop of the bells, the silence of the moment was deafening. He had to abandon his companion and seek a ship or a way out before the island sank again. The creatures were after him as well, and panic was beginning to set in. But he found a small sinkhole and crawled into it and escaped, leaving his companion behind, for if he dies at least he would be reforged anew, but if the historian died, there was nothing but death awaiting him. Consciousness returns to the stormcast like the coming of a slow tide. He is lying prone, he cannot move, and each attempt sends new floods of pain across his body. He is pinned by piles of rock. He struggles to breathe, and a momentary panic grips him as he cannot draw enough breath to fill his lungs. He wills himself to be calm, but as each new rock is added, he loses consciousness, and each time he awakes, it brings more and more pain. Pain in his legs, broken bones, or a broken spine. Weight is all over his body. It's a crushing weight. The creatures are doing some kind of ritual, but he does not know what they wait for. Something, and he is an offering, and he is helpless. He can feel his bones grind into one another. He has been there for probably days, and he has accepted his fate. And now even tiny transparent crabs were coming out and beginning to eat his flesh from his body. He had to pay no attention to the tiny pricklings of the crabs, because if he did, he would go mad knowing he was being eaten alive. Soon he begins to see that a great golden cat approaches him, like those found in the forest of Azernheim. He realizes that this is a memory, a very old memory, that despite all his reforges, he kept it with him. He reaches to the cat with his free hand. Even with all the pain, he summons the strength to move it. The great cat moves near, puts his head under his hand. His fingers rest on top of his head, and they stay this way for a while. The warmth of the cat keep him from trembling, even as a familiar cold takes grip of his heart, and he whispers, "I am sorry." Now, as this was happening to Rexaphael, the historian wakes up in a beach, but it's not part of the castle. It seems they were pulled to some different place when the island went back down to the ocean. As he walked across the shore, the atmosphere felt different, as if he was in a place where the chaos god was the ruler. And in the shore there was columns of stone, and under the pile of stones was bones. clearly those people were crushed by the rocks. And in one of the piles of the rocks, he sees his comrade Raxaphael. He rushes to him and sees he has been eaten by crabs aside from being crushed by the rocks. He tries his best to clear his naked body from the crabs, but the crabs kept coming back to feast on his flesh. As he tries to move the rocks, he knows it's futile and begins to cry and demand for his forgiveness. And they have a very soul-crushing conversation that goes, "I cannot free you. I'm not strong enough."
You asked me once if I feared death. I am afraid of what I leave behind when I die. Do not know how much of me is left.
But isn't it not better to forget this? Forget this place. The promise of a life made anew. Without ghosts. Without the crushing weight of memories.
Look for the stars, historian. There are none. Sigmar cannot see us here. There is no rebirth for me here.
And they become silent. But to regain his honor, the historian decides to stay next to Raxaphael to protect whatever is left of him, or until he passes on. He stays there for days, and now even animals have eaten Raxaphael to the point that they can go inside his body. Despite his wounds, Raxaphael does not die. The historian watches in horror as something like a flower blossoms on Raxaphael's bruised flesh. A white spot at first, and then spreading pattern of crimson veins. And for a moment he loses his mind, and days later he finally regains control over his mind and realizes that he has barricaded himself back in the observatory of the castle. And the last thing he remembered was seeing some sort of giant creature coming out. But when he thinks of this creature, he finds something to do to keep his mind occupied. Days passed, and he wanders in the castle but never ventures into the beach or sets sight to that area. He is not hungry, and when he gets cuts, his wounds do not heal, they just turn into a slimy, rotten looking flesh. He feels like death has no dominion in this realm, and eventually, with time, he will turn like one of those slimy creatures outside. After days of wandering, he feels a shift in the atmosphere, and something compels the historian to go to the beach. And there, he witnesses the silhouette of the great unclean one that is written about in the book. And in his arms, he is holding something far smaller than him, something that would resemble a broken doll, a figure ruined beyond human endurance. And as he looks closer, he watches in horror, and he notices that the body is still alive, and that body is Raxaphael. He could not contain his fear that once again he has abandoned his friend, and now he is being held by a rotten monster of Nurgle. He does not know what to do, but above him the star of his ear can be seen, revealed flickering and fading in the churn of the dark of heaven. The barrier between this place and the mortal realm has thinned, and things pass through for once. He thinks maybe this time he can do the right thing and help his friend end his suffering and send him back to Seer. But this time he has to do it quickly, for time is running out. Who knows when the star of his ear will disappear again. He searches for the crossbow of the Stormcast and rips a bolt from a long dead creature that Raxaphael killed who knows when. And he returns to the beach with the crossbow loaded and ready to end his friend's suffering. But he cannot fire. He has not the strength, and he has not the courage to end his friend's life. And he is summoning the strength to fire. He begins to notice that the unclean one is not the ruler of this land, but is also a prisoner. Its body is also being eaten by the crabs and eels, and it is separated from its god. The monster cannot die either, and is also being tormented by whatever this place is. He thinks maybe if he gets closer to Rexavel, he can finally free his friend, and he gets closer. He notices how badly Rexavel is. His body, after days of being crushed, his eyes are shut, the corners crusted with tiny shells like growths. Something moves beneath one eyelid, a sandwort-like squiggle. His bones are broken, crushed repeatedly, only to heal, to fuse together in a grotesque misalignment. His chest is caved in, but still rises and falls. Barnacles grow in clusters from the wounds on his skin. Then the historian could hear that Rexavel, barely in a whisper, says,
I was born when I met her. I was alive when she loved me. And when she died, when she was taken from me, my life also ended. But my body lived on. My life also ended. This is enough. I have had enough.
And just as he says this, he grabs the crossbow from the historian, who was now at point blank range next to Rexavel, and tells the historian to leave this place and leave this to him. And with these words, the historian leaves with hope, anger, and sadness in his heart, and yells to the heavens,
"You will watch! Sigmar, do you hear? You will watch! What sort of father would turn away, would look away from the death of his son?"
As he yelled this, the great unclean one was now even closer to Rexavel, but suddenly a bolt of lightning splits open the sky with sudden, terrifying ferocity. A sound like the world tearing in two. As the lightning touches the broken body of Rexavel, the ferocity of the bolt courses through the body of the great unclean one and rips his head off, and all is left behind is the slimy, decaying body of the monster, and the sand now turned into glass. As the lightning disappeared, the historian realized he was now alone, but he had no strength, both physically and emotionally, to keep going. So he goes to where the bolt hit, and there in the ground was the object this entire quest was all about. An egg, no bigger than his fist, blue skinned and leathery, trailing delicate strands like arms, all that remains of an ancient spirit. He places it in his mouth and swallows it. He feels it work its way within him, and then he falls asleep. When he wakes, he feels rejuvenated. His wounds have even healed, and his sickness has passed away. It could be the egg he ate that caused this, and with his new strength, he finds a new purpose to get out of the island. He gets woods that is scattered around and builds a raft, and before he sails off to the unknown, he goes to the chamber of the Lord of the Sea, and he gets the now just pure bone skull of the Lady of the Sea, that ancient spirit from the land of Gur, and takes with him the skull, so he can give it a proper burial in Gur where it belongs. He sails off and does not know where he is going, but he does not look back to that cursed place. An unknown time later, the historian finds himself again looking out into the Sea of Shaish, and just like that time ago, and suddenly a stormcast approaches him and says he is a night quester sent by Sigmar to look for an object in the city of Amaranth, and he is looking for the historian to help him aid in his quest. The historian asks the night quester for his name, but he does not answer. He just wants to get on with his quest and not give any answers to the historian. But the historian tells him that his quest is futile. The object he seeks was eaten by a demon and lost in the middle of the sea. And before the night quester leaves, he notices the skull and demands what it is, for he has never seen one like this before. The historian smiles and says it's an ancient spirit of Gur, and he will travel there to bury it where it belongs. And as the historian watches the night quester leave, he thinks of the last passage of the book, as it says, "If you read this, know that I watched them all drown. I feel the life leaving me. But there is one more thing I must record. As I lie here, I see a light in the forlorn heavens. I see the star of his ear. A white eye watches me through the mists. The God King has returned."